Chapter 5, Government and Politics in China. Let China sleep, for when China wakes, it'll shake the world. Napoleon Bonaparte. Ancient China was arguably one of the strongest, richest empires in existence, so much so that often rulers saw little value in contacting anyone else in the world. Even though China's power was much diminished by the era of Napoleon, his words describing China as a sleeping giant prophesied the China of the early 21st century, a great civilization on the rise again. Since Western countries first began exploring the world several centuries ago, they have tended to either ignore or exploit China in world politics. And yet the presence of China is deeply felt, sometimes promising riches and cooperation, and other times threatening competition and destruction. Today, China stands as one of the few remaining communist nations, with no signs of renouncing communism. China is by some standards a less developed country, but on the other hand, the country is now a major world power, partly because of recent dramatic improvements in GNP and standards of living. China no longer sleeps. Its leaders claim membership in the World Trade Organization, travel frequently to other countries, and take an active part in the United Nations. The world now comes to China for its vast array of products, and more, China is going outside its borders for investments, labor supplies, and raw materials. Its steady move toward capitalism has led some to argue that democratization will follow. Yet the government remains highly authoritarian, providing evidence that marketization and privatization do not always go hand in hand with democracy. Sovereignty, authority, and power. Until the 20th century, China's history was characterized by dynastic cycles, long periods of rule by a family punctuated by times of chaos, when the family lost its power and was challenged by a new and ultimately successful ruling dynasty. Power was determined by the mandate of heaven, or the right to rule as seen by the collective ancestral wisdom that guided the empire from the heavens above. For many centuries, public authority rested in the hands of the emperor and an elaborate bureaucracy that exercised this highly centralized power. After a time of chaos in the early 20th century, Communist leader Mao Zedong took over China in 1949, bringing in a new regime with values that often disagreed with traditional concepts of power. How different is the new China from the old? Have the changes brought instability, or have they successfully transformed the country into a modern world power? China's political structures reflect many modern influences, but the weight of tradition has shaped them in unique ways. For example, China is technically governed by a constitution that grants formal authority to both party and state executive and legislative offices. However, the country is still governed by authoritarian elites who are not bound by rule of law. As long as the rulers are above the law, the constitution will not be a major source of legitimacy for the state. Legitimacy. Under dynastic rule, Chinese citizens were subjects of the emperor. Legitimacy was established through the mandate of heaven, and power passed from one emperor to the next through hereditary connections within the ruling family. As long as things went well, the emperor's authority was generally accepted. But when problems occurred and the dynasty weakened, rival families challenged the throne, claiming that the emperor had lost the mandate. Legitimacy was not for peasants to determine, although popular rebellions and unrest in the countryside served as signs that the emperor was failing. The revolution of 1911 gave birth to the Chinese Republic, with Western-educated Sun Yat-sen as its first president. The new regime was supposed to be democratic, with legitimacy resting on popular government. However, regional warlords challenged the government, and much as they always had done in times of political chaos. Emerging from the mayhem was Mao Zedong, with his own version of authority, an ideology known as Maoism. The People's Republic of China was established in 1949, and Mao led the Communist Party as the new wielder of power until his death in 1976. Inspired by Marxism, Maoism was idealistic and egalitarian, and even though it endorsed centralized power exercised through the top leaders of the party, it stressed the importance of staying connected to the peasants through a process called mass line. Mass line required leaders to listen to and communicate with ordinary folks, and without it, the legitimacy of rulers was questionable. Despite this important difference between Maoism and Leninism, which based its authority on the urban proletariat, the organizing principle for both ideologies was democratic centralism. Democratic centralism allowed leaders to make decisions that could not be questioned by the people, and gave both Lenin and Mao almost complete control over policymaking. Since Mao's death, the Politburo of the Communist Party remains a legitimate source of power in China, but the leadership has come under a great deal of criticism in recent years. The party is said to be corrupt and irrelevant, holding authoritarian power over an increasingly market-based economy. In truth, rebellions against the party have flared up throughout PRC history, but the rumblings have been louder and more frequent since the Tiananmen incident in 1989. How serious a threat these criticisms are to the current regime is a matter of some debate, and the current communist leaders showed no signs of loosening the party's hold on the government and the economy. One important source of power in the People's Republic of China has been the military. The military played an important role in the rise of the Communist Party, and it is represented in the government by the Central Military Commission. The head of this commission plays an important role in policy making. For example, longtime leader Deng Xiaoping was never a general secretary of the Communist Party, but he directed the Central Military Commission. Historical traditions. Despite the fact that the last dynasty, the Qing, fell in the early 20th century, many traditions from the dynastic era influenced the modern political system. Authoritarian power. China's borders have changed over time, but it has long been a huge and land-based empire ruled from a central place by either an emperor or a small group of people. Chinese citizens have traditionally been subjects of, not participants in, their political system. Despite the many dynasties in China's history, the ruling family was always subject to attack from regional warlords who challenged their right to the mandate of heaven. This tendency toward decentralization is apparent in the modern regime as a centralized Politburo attempts to control its vast population and numerous policies and problems. Confucianism. This philosophy has shaped the Chinese political system since the 6th century BCE. It emphasized the importance of order and harmony, encouraged Chinese citizens to submit to the emperor's power, and reinforced the emperor's responsibility to fulfill his duties conscientiously. This aspect of Confucianism may be tied to democratic centralism, or the communist belief in a small group of leaders who make decisions for the people. Confucianism is still a major influence on Chinese society today, as it contradicts the egalitarian ideology of communism with its central belief in unequal relationships and mutual respect among people of different statuses, especially within families. Bureaucratic hierarchy based on scholarship. The emperors surrounded themselves with highly organized bureaucracies that formed an elite based on Confucian scholarship. Government jobs were highly coveted and extremely competitive, with only a small percentage of candidates mastering the examination system. The exams were knowledge-based, and bureaucrats had to be well-versed in Confucianism and many related philosophies. A major social divide in ancient China was between a large peasant population and the bureaucratic elite. The Middle Kingdom. Since ancient times, the Chinese have referred to their country as Zhongguo, meaning Middle Kingdom, or the place that is a center of civilization. Foreigners were seen as barbarians whose civilizations were far inferior to China's, not just in terms of power, but also in terms of ethics and quality of life. All countries are ethnocentric in their approaches to other countries, but China almost always assumed that no one else had much to offer. After the empire's 19th century weaknesses was exploited by imperialist powers, these traditional assumptions were challenged but not destroyed. Communist ideologies. The 20th century brought the new influences of Maoism that emphasized the right thinking and moralism of Confucianism, but contradicted the hierarchical nature of the old regime with its insistence on egalitarianism. The late 20th century brought Deng Xiaoping theory, a practical mix of authoritarian political control and economic privatization. Political culture. China's political culture is multidimensional and deep, shaped by geographical features and by the many eras of its history, dynastic rule, control by imperialist nations, and its aftermath, and the communist rule. Geographic influences. Today, China has the largest population of any country on Earth, and its land surface is the third largest after Russia and Canada. Some of its most important geographical features include access to ocean's ice-free ports, many large navigable rivers, major geographical climate splits between north and south, geographic isolation of the western part of the country, mountain ranges, deserts, and oceans that separate China from other countries. These geographic features have shaped Chinese political development for centuries. China's location in the world and protective mountain ranges allowed the Chinese to ignore the rest of the world whenever they wanted to until the 19th century. The rugged terrain of the western part of the country has limited population growth there. The large navigable rivers and good harbors of the east have attracted population, so that the overwhelming majority of people in China have lived in these areas for centuries. Differences in climate and terrain have also created a cultural split between the north and the south. Historical eras. 1. Dynastic rule. The political culture inherited from centuries of dynastic rule centers on Confucian values, such as order, harmony, and a strong sense of hierarchy, superior and subservient positions. China has traditionally valued scholarship as a way to establish superiority, with Mandarin scholars filling bureaucratic positions in the government. China's early relative isolation from other countries contributes to a strong sense of cultural identity. Related to Chinese identity is a high degree of ethnocentrism, the sense that China is central to humanity, the Middle Kingdom, and superior to other countries. Centuries of expansion and invasion have brought many other Asian people under Chinese control, resulting in long-standing tensions between Han, Chinese, and other groups. A modern example is Tibet, where a strong sense of Tibetan ethnicity has created resistance to Chinese control. 2. Resistance to imperialism. During the 19th century, China's strong sense of cultural identity blossomed into nationalism as it resisted persistent attempts by imperialist nations, such as England, France, Germany, and Japan, to exploit China's natural resources and people. This nationalism was secured by the Revolution of 1911, and the hatred of foreign devils has led China to be cautious and suspicious in its dealings with capitalist countries ever since. 3. Maoism. Mao Zedong was strongly influenced by Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, but his version of communism is distinctly suited to China. Whereas Lenin emphasized the importance of a party vanguard to lead the people to revolution and beyond, Mao resisted the inequality implied by Lenin's beliefs. He believed in the strength of the peasant and centered his philosophy on these values. Collectivism, valuing the good of the community above that of the individual, suited the peasant-based communities that have existed throughout Chinese history. It contrasts the beliefs of scholars, valued by the old culture, who often have been drawn to individualism. Struggle and activism. Mao encouraged people to actively pursue the values of socialism, something he understood would require struggle and devotion. Mass line. Mao conceptualized a line of communication between party leaders, members, and peasants that would allow all to struggle toward realization of the goals of a communist state. The mass line involved teaching and listening on everyone's part. Leaders would communicate their will and direction to the people, but the people in turn would communicate their wisdoms to the leaders through the mass line. Egalitarianism. Hierarchy was the key organizing principle in Chinese society before 1949, and Mao's emphasis on creating an egalitarian society was in complete opposition to it. Self-reliance. Instead of relying on the elite to give directions, people under Maoist rule were encouraged to rely on their own talents to contribute to their communities. 4. Deng Xiaoping theory. It doesn't matter whether a cat is white or black, as long as it catches mice. This famous statement by Deng reflects his practical approach to solving China's problems. In other words, he didn't worry too much about whether a policy was capitalist or socialist, as long as it improved the economy. The result of his leadership, 1978 to 1997, was a dramatic turnaround of the Chinese economy through a combination of socialist planning and the capitalist free market. His political and social views, however, remained true to communist tradition. The party should supervise all, and no allowances should be made for individual freedoms and/or democracy. The importance of informal relationships. Especially among the political elite, power and respect depend not so much on official positions as on who has what connections to whom. During the days of the early PRC, these ties were largely based on reputations established during the Long March. In 1934 to 1936 cross-country trek led by Mao Zedong as Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army pursued his communist followers. Today those leaders are dead, but factions of their followers still compete for power, and informal relationships define each change in leadership. This informal network, a version of patron clientelism, is not apparent to the casual outside observer. As a result, whenever new leaders come to power, such as the 2003 and 2013 transitions, it isn't easy to predict how policymaking will be affected. However, an important principle is to study their relationships with past leaders. For example, it is significant that Hu Yaobang, a reformer whose death was mourned by the students that led to Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, mentored Hu Jintao, who later became General Secretary of the CCP. Also important is the fact that, before he died, Deng Xiaoping designated Hu Jintao as his fourth-generation successor. Chinese nationalism. The identity of Han Chinese, the predominant ethnic group in China, goes back to ancient times. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Chinese nationalists fought hard against the Western imperialists that dominated China, and they eventually won their country's independence. This pride in Chinese culture and accomplishments is apparent in China today, especially in recent years. By sensitivity to Westerners who often are reacted to it as a third world country. Whereas Mao encouraged his people to ignore the outside world and concentrate on growing the country from within, China has become increasingly involved in world politics and trade since the early days of Deng Xiaoping's rule. The 2008 Olympics were intended to showcase China's growing place in the world, and many Chinese people reacted strongly to the protests that erupted in some Western cities as the Olympic torch passed through on its way to Beijing. Chinese nationalists used the internet to express their anger toward pro-Tibetan Western press coverage of the unrest in Tibet. Tibetans and other minority groups are seen as inferior people by some strong nationalists, and their pride in being Han Chinese is often apparent. Another indication that Chinese nationalism is on the rise is a reaction that some have had to the global economic crisis of late 2008. As the West has suffered, many have predicted the demise of the United States, a situation which Chinese nationalists have seen as an opportunity to reassert the new global ascendancy of the Middle Kingdom. At the G20 meeting of the 20 largest national economies in April 2009, Chinese nationalists saw significance in the fact that President Hu Jintao stood to the right of host Gordon Brown, Britain, in the front center of the official photograph of the leaders gathered for the summit. Others proclaimed that the G20 meeting was irrelevant, and the only significant summit was the G2 meeting between President Barack Obama and Hu Jintao. As China's economic star has risen in recent years, it has been supported by a large dose of traditional pride in the glory of one of the world's oldest civilizations, as it reclaims what is believed to be its rightful position in the world. Attitudes toward the West. The Chinese have long held conflicting attitudes towards Westerners. When the British statesman Earl Macartney arrived in China in the late 1700s seeking trade, the Chinese emperor rejected his overtures, believing that China had little to gain from the less wealthy and cultured British. Once China was carved up by foreign powers during the 19th century, many educated Chinese wondered whether Western culture might be superior. During the early 20th century, a major source of tension among Chinese leaders was between those who promoted Chinese self-reliance and those seeking modernization through contacts with the West. In the mid-20th century, Mao Zedong rejected Western notions of human rights and electoral democracy and banished most foreign residents. Since the late 1970s, China has opened up to both Western trade and culture, but the conflicting attitudes still remain. These tensions are apparent in modern-day China, and they sometimes spill over into the media. In 2012, Xinhua, the state-run news agency, ran an editorial that accused other governments of using reporters from their countries to control China's image in the overseas news media. About the same time, People's Daily, the ruling Communist Party paper, described Western efforts to export democracy and human rights to China as a new form of colonialism. However, Western countries, with their rule of law and individual freedoms, still have an enduring appeal to many educated Chinese.